Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, for me, a heroine. She was, for the country, a cultural icon. And even for conservative colleagues on the Supreme Court, she was a great justice. In this session, what we're going to do is not talk about what her loss means to jurisprudence necessarily, although I'll get to some of that, but to examine the political impact of her passing and the swift nomination and attempted fast-track confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Our panel, Jane Junn. She's a colleague of mine in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Her expertise is public opinion, political behavior, polling methods, and analysis. She's also the University of Southern California Associate's Chair in Social Sciences and a professor of political science and gender studies at USC Dornsife. She's authored 5 books on political participation and public opinion in the U.S. Jeff Jenkins is the Provost Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and Law. He is the Judith and John Bedrosian Chair of Government in the Public Enterprise. He's director of the Bedrosian Center and director of the Political Institutions and Political Economy Collaborative. Mike Murphy is the co-director of the Center for the Political Future. He's been involved as a leading figure in 6 Republican presidential campaigns, including as the chief strategist for John McCain in the 2000 primaries. He's worked on countless Senate and gubernatorial campaigns all across the country. In fact, he ran Arnold Schwarzenegger's campaign for governor in 2003. He's also a political analyst for NBC News. I'm going to start with my first question. Hearings on Judge Barrett's confirmation begin on Monday. Polls show that a majority of Americans believe that this Supreme Court seat should be filled by the winner of the 2020 election. Can the Trump campaign nonetheless use this battle to close the gap in the states they need to win? And maybe I'll start with Mike, and then just people can just pick up the conversation.
Well, it's a pretty big gap, so it would take miraculous political ability. The other thing is that because of the polling numbers, Bob, that you cited, and the fact that a lot of the partisan political fighting over this nomination will revolve less around theories of constitutional law, but more around kind of the sports fan theory of the Supreme Court, which is you're kind of rooting for your issue. And what does a justice nomination mean for your issue, which in my view is kind of a crazy way to do it, but that's how many people do. The Democrats have 2 potent issues. In the suburbs, where Trump has been losing for 3 years and is the main driver of his political problems, there are more pro-choice voters, particularly among the voters that Trump needs to attract, suburban women, than there are pro-life voters. So in that calculus, there's no real traction for the president to improve his standings. He'll just please the voters he already has. There's also the question of how the court will interact with the potential end of the ACA, the Obamacare, which is distilled in politics to a pretty good bumper sticker about you, voter, going to lose your pre-existing conditions. The Democrats used that to great effect in 2018, it was their most popular campaign message in their advertising. It worked. So we're going to hear a lot of that. So I don't see a lot of opportunities in this unless the hearings are conducted in a way that is very, very insulting to Amy Coney Barrett, who's an impressive person. And, it could then be seen as a fumble, and maybe the Trump campaign could exploit it. The last thing I'd say is there is some upside in the Senate races, because the pro-life issue, well, won't help Trump in the suburbs. There are places like South Carolina where Lindsey Graham is in a surprisingly tight race, potentially even behind, where the states that tilt more pro-life, where there could be some energy for the Republican candidate out of a big hearing fight, should get a lot of attention.
Jane or Jeff, you want to come in?
So I agree. I don't think that there's much opportunity here to close the gap for Trump. I think what's important here for the Republicans is to essentially give their base, the Republican base, what they want. So to the degree that they don't go forward with this, they will lose a lot of people. So what this can do, at least, is mobilize the base and make sure that the voters that they definitely need to turn out will turn out in the election.
Jane, do you think the base is enough? And is base politics at this point a way forward for Trump?
Well, if we learned anything from 2016, the base was enough back then. So I think the question is, and the extent to which I think we're talking about either turnout, mobilization, or conversion. This is not a conversion issue. This is a turnout mobilization issue. So just as Jeff mentioned, as Mike as well, the question here is the extent to which this issue mobilizes more people to actually come out and vote. You're not going to change anybody's mind at this point. And for the mythical, still undecided voter, this isn't going to be the issue that does it.
Mike mentioned the whole notion that the Affordable Care Act and the protection of pre-existing conditions could be in trouble. Joe Biden has tried to frame the debate around the Barrett nomination on that issue, striking down protections for people with pre-existing conditions. This drove the Democratic victory in 2018. Does it have the potential to do that here? And can this contribute to that?
I mean, maybe a bit. I think that's the way that the Democrats should focus their commentary on the Barrett nomination, right? I mean, they certainly want to stay away from things like religion, and that's kind of the third rail here, and focus on the things that they can either mobilize their base around, or, as Jane said, for those mythical undecideds, right, to essentially persuade them to vote Democrat. I'll simply say that I think it is important to remember that the court cares about legitimacy, right? So the court is it is seen as this independent body from politics, but Chief Justice Roberts and certainly the other members of the court care about the court's legitimacy, and they are aware of where public opinion is on important issues. So I think that needs to be kind of thought about whenever we think about what will the court do? Will they strike down X? Will they repeal X?
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Mike, why, if this issue isn't so effective for Trump, why is he so determined to push it forward? Is it Jane's reason, base mobilization, or is the base mobilized anyway?
Yeah, the base is turnout's the most overrated thing in a presidential campaign. The presidential elections have a higher natural turnout than off-year elections, significantly so, materially so. So I think there are probably people in the Trump world who are trying to rationalize the reason and think it'll help there. But my view is they're sacrificing political tactics for an ideological win on the court. This is not a move to gain the president political power. This is a move to move the court in a conservative direction from, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a leading liberal voice on the court, to somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, who would be a conservative, more originalist, so to speak, voice. So regardless of who wins or loses, they're trying to make the 20-year dent, which is why, frankly, I think almost either party in this circumstance would kind of break the dinner party china and force a late approval through, because the ideological stakes of the court are so high. The Republicans just look particularly hypocritical because of the Merrick Garland debate, where they were all very, very worried about an election year appointment. That's all evaporated in a big mist of hypocrisy. But the power politics of the Supreme Court, it's so important that people are willing to take what is rare, political pain for it. So maybe Trump rationalizes it to himself that way, but this is a move to affect the court beyond this presidential election.
Are these hearings?
I think that's true. And you have to remember that the Republicans have not had a legislative agenda for over a decade, right? They just haven't cared about pushing any positive issues to the extent that they cared about anything. They wanted to eliminate Obamacare. And prior to the midterms, right, they gave Trump, a tax relief bill. But, going back to, 2008 to the present, they haven't really had any kind of meaningful legislative agenda. The Republican policymaking agenda at the national level for the last decade has been to essentially put more conservatives on the court, the federal courts, and when they have the opportunity, when they control the presidency, to roll back regulations. That's where they've focused their attention on policy. So for the Republicans not to move forward now, to put, when a vacancy occurs on the court, and McConnell has raised so much money over the last decade or more on this issue, is a loser. They simply have to go forward with this.
Let me ask Jane: are the confirmation hearings that we're about to enter into on Monday, are they an opportunity for Kamala Harris, or are they a danger? And how should she behave?
I think they're both, and I think it depends on who you're talking to. So, in terms of will they benefit her, I thought that. I'm not really a pundit. I'm just a professor. And so by definition, I'm not a pundit, and I don't have any advice for Kamala Harris. I think she did a pretty darn good job the other night on the debate stage. And I think that tight wire is similar to what she has to walk probably in the confirmation hearings. But I think that one of the things that keep asking, and that we should maybe answer more directly, is how are the voters going to respond to this? Because after all, that's really all that matters in this. And so we're not only talking about voters in the presidentials, but we're talking about all of the voters in states with Senate elections and all of the House elections up for grabs, for which both chambers are at this point looking pretty good for the Democrats, you could argue, if you believe the data. So I think it's important to not give a single answer, because the electorate is not homogeneous. And it's not just polarized, it's also heterogeneous inside of that. So when if you were to ask me, how would women respond when, let's say, the last confirmation hearing with Brett Kavanaugh and Kamala Harris's performance there, can she behave the same way with Amy Coney Barrett as she did with Brett Kavanaugh? Probably not. But I think it's important for us to disaggregate who it is that we think is being affected by this. Will liberals be affected by it? Probably not much at all. What you're thinking about and wondering about is, will white female voters who are Republicans and who like the politics of Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, as well as her potential judicial philosophy, be motivated one way or another by Harris? In my view, that's the important group to consider, and not the rest. Which isn't to say that it's not important for Republican males either. But I think that the questions that we ask about and the predictions we want to make have to be based in the section of the electorate that is relevant here. And to that, I think it's really interesting. Amy Coney Barrett is such an interesting bookend to the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's interesting to me as a scholar of not only political science, but gender studies, that Amy Coney Barrett has a gender consciousness of her own that is totally different from what you could argue on the basis of her decisions and her opinions and her writings, totally different from that set forward by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It doesn't mean she doesn't have a gender consciousness. She just has a very different one from how most political commentators, left and right, think about what gender consciousness is. Gender consciousness for a conservative woman is about a womanhood that is a traditional set of values, that is pleasing to patriarchy rather than in opposition to it. And so if people are confused about why women are supporting Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, don't be confused. Stop and think for a minute about what it is that gender consciousness is in a womanhood defined by white patriarchy.
Mike, I'm not sure you want to comment on that, but you might. But you might want to comment on how Harris should behave at the hearings.
Yeah, look, I'm just going to do the practical politics. I'm not a gender studies professor. I don't really have complicated opinions about that, nor deep knowledge. I would say, first of all, this will not be the center of the campaign. Second, the campaign is in the land the big plane phase. We've already got probably 25% of the absentee vote in transit, people who voted already. So every day the electorate shrinks and the ability to affect it is dramatically diminishing by any issue. As far as what Kamala Harris should do, is she should remember, as she already knows, so it won't be hard to remember, and I'm sure the campaign staff has been unsubtle in reminding her of this, that she doesn't have to try to go out and win the whole campaign. If absolutely nothing happens other than this team, that team, Washington theater on cable television, that's good for Biden. It's big issues breaking out. It's gaffes, it's mistakes that are the danger. So I think she will be encouraged, and appropriately so, to not have to carry the whole battle, to not try to win the whole campaign with theatrics, but to be respectful, to, make the ideological points she wishes to make and let others be part of it. You've got Amy Klobuchar there and other effective political communicators. The idea is to raise the threat to people who are ideologically opposed to the Republicans in this choice in a clear way, and not let Washington theatrics. I do a podcast with David Axelrod. We had Claire McCaskill, former senator from Missouri, Democrat, quite politically savvy. And she put out what I thought was a shrewd warning to the Democrats that this should not be the politics of it, should not be a platform for handmaiden tale costumes and theater and histrionics, because that becomes a distraction that Trump can exploit. So from the Democratic point of view, nice hearings with a clear message about the policy implications to voters who care about that stuff, which they have good reason to think represents a lot of their winning coalition, is the strategy. Big moments to try to end an Aaron Sorkin movie with the angry speech are risky, and therefore, at this point in the campaign, ill-advised.
Jeff, I'm going to ask you about a little bit more about these confirmation hearings. 3 Senate Republicans have tested positive for COVID and are isolating themselves. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas says they will be carried in on a stretcher if necessary to approve Barrett in the Judiciary Committee and then confirm her on the floor before the election. Most commentators believe the Democrats don't have any tools to prevent this. Do you share that view?
I share that view. As long as the Republicans have the votes and they can get their members there, there's nothing that the Democrats can do. And it's good to remember, I was taught many years ago on the politics of the U.S. House that really the key is the rules are what the majority say that they are. Yeah. And it's really true of the Senate now too, right? It's trended in that direction, and it is certainly true now as well. They have 51 votes, roughly speaking, right? And if they get past the procedural hurdles, they'll probably have all 53 in favor of Barrett. So I don't see any reason, when you think about the rationale, right, for Gardner or McSally or Ernst or Collins or some of the others, right? If you want a political career past your time in the Senate as a Republican, it's really dangerous to defect from this. McConnell's a pretty savvy character. He has the votes, and I think he's going to prevail here.
Mike, you're a Republican who's defected. Would any of these Republicans in the Senate pay a terrible price if they were to vote against her?
Yes. Some might appropriately, because their states are more conservative and they elect senators of the point of view of the majority in the state, at least the most organized majority, and they expect their voice to be heard. If Joni Ernst in Iowa, who is in trouble, possibly a few points behind in a tilt Republican state, the pro-life coalition in Iowa is incredibly powerful in Republican politics. If she was seen as doing that, she would certainly lose the campaign.
What about
Maine? She might
lose
it already, but she'd certainly lose it.
What about Maine?
Well, Maine's different, but Collins has taken a walk on the timing issue. So she's not really germane to this. She and Susan Murkowski have both said, there's a side issue to this, which is a process issue, less about the judge, but about the politics of forcing this thing through at the end. Now, the Republicans, as I said before, carry that extra weight. And I personally believe, as a never Trump Republican, that we carry a little weight of good government right now to kind of prove we're capable of it, rather than pure power politics. I think we ought to pay a little tax on that. And it is appropriate to say, as Collins does, and Murkowski, that let's see who wins the election, and then the Senate the one that the people elect now, because this choice is being litigated in the election. Because of the timing, they get to choose. But
Mike, if Ernst votes no, what votes does she gain in Iowa?
If she votes no, she gains nothing.
Okay,
that's my point.
Why would she vote no then?
No, I think maybe I
misunderstood you.
misunderstood the question.
Yeah.
So I'll
Okay.
restate. Bob said if Joni Ernst voted no, would she pay a big price? Voted against the confirmation of Coney
A
Barrett.
more general question. What I asked was, can any of these Republicans vote no and survive politically?
Right. And what I said was in a state like Iowa, it's death. It would be death for Lindsey Graham in the highly improbable world where he'd vote no. Now, you can argue Cory Gardner, who's busy losing Colorado, a state where the pro-choice movement is stronger than the pro-life movement. Maybe there's a net gain, but he's already in such trouble. I don't think it would be nearly enough to win. And again, he would. So this is the problem that almost any Republican has now, almost regardless of the abortion politics in their state. Their pollster comes in and says, well, here's the problem. You got to get 20% of or 15% of the Biden voters to vote for you to win here in Colorado. And they say, great, I'll say nice things about Biden. Yeah, but 85% of your voters like Trump. So pick which, wood chipper you want to jump into. And of course, they freeze and do nothing, and a lot of them are going to lose. And now 2 years ago, they might have been able to build a little brand equity to get through this by distancing a bit, gently over time, to build their own identity to survive it. But none of them had the courage to do it because they were worried about Republican primaries. So no, there's no, the two who are most likely to flip over, flipped over. And that's why Mitch has the votes. Now, there's a little thing, and I don't want to go on forever in the minutia, but because the Arizona race is a special election held on election day, the state law says you're certified, you're in the Senate the minute you're certified, and there's a Democratic Secretary of State, so there'll be no monkey business there. That means that if Kelly wins, as every poll indicates, on December 1st or 2nd, he'll become a senator in the lame duck, cutting Mitch's vote count by 1 in a tight vote count. So if they're unable to schedule in COVID to vote before the election, which I think is possible, they don't want that, but it could happen. In a lame duck, it's a little more fragile. One, they're going to lose a vote. Delaying tactics may be able to push it to December in the lame duck. And the weight of public opinion will get much worse on this. It's bad now. It'll get worse that this is a total banana republic move. So I think there's a narrow scenario where Mitch can't get it done. But if the vote is before the election and COVID doesn't stop him, he's got the votes.
Jane, I want to go back to something you were saying. Did you want to say something? Go ahead.
I did. I want to respond to this because all very interesting. I'd forgotten about that. And I did not know that that was the case in Arizona. It's very interesting. It still leaves the Democrats short. But let's remember, and this goes back to a question that you had raised, Bob, about the ACA. This election in some states maybe is more about abortion, but it isn't just about abortion. I think in the most general terms, what is coming before the Supreme Court is possibly abortion, but plenty of other things as well, for which RBG is at quite the opposite end of the continuum from Amy Coney Barrett. And these include general equality issues that are not about reproductive rights, but that are about working rights, that are about the rights of racial minorities, voting rights. There's plenty of other things in this mix, and it's not just abortion. I understand that the abortion lobby, the pro-life lobby, is a strong one, particularly in places like Iowa. But as Bob had indicated before, there's a panoply of issues here involved that do not speak only to abortion.
But let me follow up with you, and because both you and Mike talked earlier about women, and Mike talked about Trump's trouble with white suburban women, especially white suburban college-educated women, and then you described another segment of women who might be where Amy Coney Barrett is. Trump has to get back a fair number of those women in the suburbs in order to win the election. He can't win the election without doing that. So how would you parse the impact of this on women differentially in terms of helping Trump or hurting Trump?
I'm afraid I just don't buy the idea that he's doing that much worse among, quote unquote, suburban women. The suburbs, as you know, are not the suburbs of the Real Housewives of Orange County anymore. The suburbs are everybody. And when Donald Trump tweets out to suburban housewives, he's not doing that as a term of derision. He's not saying to the liberal women of the world, they think this is a term of derision. But to the conservative women of the world and the Republican women, being a suburban housewife is actually a good thing. It says that your man can take care of you and you don't have to work and you live in a quiet and safe place with good schools. And so I think it's important to consider that, any movement being made among white women, and I'm just going to talk about white women here only because minority women are generally speaking very difficult to convert them over to the Republican side. I don't see him doing that much worse, and I definitely don't see Biden doing that much better with college-educated white women. He's at about the same rate as Hillary Clinton with college-educated white women, whether they live in San Francisco or they live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Instead, Trump is slipping a bit. But in my view, somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, who speaks to professional success as well as traditional gender values, is actually a rallying point for women here. It's helping him, in my view. And, if we had to take a bet about whether white women would support Republicans again by a majority, as they have in every presidential election since 1952, with two exceptions, I think I'm sticking with white women will continue to support Trump in this election as well.
Yeah. Mike, that's not what our data would show in the USC Dornsife poll, right?
Well, the question is, white women traditionally, frankly, all Caucasians vote Republican. But because almost nobody else does, the Republicans have to build up a big lead. And as the percentage of Caucasians in the overall electorate keeps shrinking, that becomes more and more of a problem. So, what we're seeing, at least most of the private polling, I haven't looked at the latest one. Our ballot has been so solid. I haven't looked lately, but I look at a lot of polling in the key states because I care more about them in my practitioner world than I do in the public thing. And Trump is definitely underperforming in most places among college-educated white women. And we're seeing. But my point is Trump needs big movement to catch up.
But by underperforming, you mean he's doing worse than he was doing, a couple points worse than he was doing last time around. But when you have 45% of college when you have 40, well, I was just looking at a recent Washington Post ABC poll where in Wisconsin, where you see him down by about 10 points relative to Biden. But at the same time, college-educated white women, only 45% of them are supporting Biden still. So it's not like it is a major wash for Trump. He still has a strong set of supporters there.
It's not enough. But anyway, we can argue about polling and put everybody to sleep. And unfortunately, the ABC Washington
let's
Post
argue
polls
about polling.
I don't believe in. But we're meet after the election once we have the adjusted exits, and then we can settle this debate.
Let me back off and ask a larger question, and I'll start with Jeff. What ramifications is this Supreme Court battle going to have on our institutions? Will it make it more likely, for example, that the case for eliminating the filibuster will prevail, or the Democrats will enlarge the Supreme Court, claiming that Republicans have already packed it?
Or that the Democrats will add to the number of states that we have, for example? I'll give you a definitive answer. Maybe. I think a lot of this depends upon how large the Democratic majority in the Senate is going to be, right? That's going to be the key issue. One thing we have to remember when we're talking about all of the Republicans in trouble is that the Republicans will pick up a seat in Alabama in the Senate. So there's going to be a net one from there. So if the Democrats have 50 seats in the Senate and they take the presidency and they have a really bare majority, well, it's going to be hard to convince Joe Manchin to go along with some of these things, for example, in the very red state of West Virginia. Sinema in Arizona is also not someone who is going to be easily persuaded to go far left, for example, with a major policy change. The Democratic coalition, even if it's a little bit larger, is not going to be a homogenous coalition, right? There's going to be a lot of differentiation within that coalition. And if you're going to strike down the filibuster on policy, that's a major strike. That is going to be something that will have major effects going forward. The scary scenario for Republicans and conservatives is, the Democrats get 52, 53 seats in the Senate, and suddenly we're going to have a Green New Deal. And I think that's I don't want to call that a Hail Mary, but I think that's a very optimistic scenario that's being floated out there. We're entering an interesting period for sure, right? Going forward, the next few years are going to be interesting. There might be some major changes. There might not be some major changes. I think my gut tells me that if I had to bet, we're not going to have a lot of major changes.
Mike, you want to take a crack at that?
Boy, I think I agree with Jeff. So the institutionalists in the Senate don't like, including Biden, by the way, who hasn't publicly said it, don't like getting rid of the filibuster. And the ones with longer memory in both parties, albeit a shrinking group, the Supreme Court politics in the Senate kind of troubled them privately, because there's been sort of an auction to politicize the Supreme Court even more. It started out with the famous borking of Robert Bork, where a real political campaign was run against him. And of course, when one party does it, the other says, see, it works, we're going to do it better. And so then when all the judges got kind of, not Supreme Court judges, lower judges, got jammed up in the Obama era, Harry Reid, then the majority leader, went to the so-called nuclear option to blow up the 60% threshold for those judges. And Mitch McConnell put on his Dracula cape at the time and said, look what you're starting here. And sure enough, he doubled down. And now here we are with the Supreme Court. And so the next progression in this kind of bipartisan dance, which I don't think has been particularly good for the country, is, are we going to blow up the filibuster so we can pass anything? Well, could be with us forever. And then will we expand the Supreme Court? A question that's so passionate in the Democratic coalition that so far Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have refused to answer it. Now, I think if you poured a good bottle of whiskey down Joe's throat and some truth serum, he would say, no, it's a crazy idea. And I don't think as president, he'll support it. But the fever pitch of the election and worry about progressive backlash have led him not to talk about it. Because if that starts, then both parties, it's like, and this has happened, as you all know, in American history. There's a reason we have North and South Dakota, printing Senate seats. So we could have a Supreme Court with 37 people on it. It just becomes a crazy arms race. If I had to bet, and I wouldn't bet a lot, I think they may blow up the filibuster. I do not think they're going to expand the Supreme Court.
Jane, you want to weigh in on this? And then I have one last question. We're going to turn it over to the audience.
No, I'm gonna change the topic, and I want to respond to Penny and Roz, who both got questions in the chat and the Q&A. And yeah, I thought this was about RBG too. So let's just talk about her for a minute. And the reason why it is about RBG is the institutions are not just Congress and what happens in the rules of Congress, but what the Congress decides to do will depend on what the court does, right? So the whole reason we're having this conversation is because RBG is no longer with us and Amy Coney Barrett is the next one on. So I do want to return to that and really do talk more about her story, because that's why we're here. At the same time, I just want a quick response to Roz, and you are correct that white women are not a monolith. White women are pretty evenly split down the middle, but white women have always been more Republican. So there are a faction of women who will vote Trump, but that faction is much larger by an order of magnitude, about 10% in the last election, and it remains to be seen this time how they do. That's a big switch. 10% of your voting population needs to be persuaded to go elsewhere. That is a big switch. So if you're seeing it in your data, you should be suspicious of it. But let's get back to Penny's question, or Penny's invocation to us to talk about RBG, because this is what we're here to talk about. We're talking about her legacy on the court.
Can I say one thing?
Can I say one thing? Bob, I'm speaking.
I'm not trying. I just want to make it clear. No.
Now I know what RBG felt like on the court after Sandra Day O'Connor left. Okay.
Jane,
Yes.
This panel specifically was to discuss the political implications of her passing and the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. And there's been another panel that's talked about her and her legacy. I certainly had no intention of shortchanging it, and I have no intention of cutting you off. So go ahead.
Thank you, Bob. What I want to talk about, though, is the institution of the Supreme Court. So Mike and Jeff have talked about Congress. So I want to talk about the Supreme Court and how it is and what it is that what RBG's legacy is and how they are going to be in the position to have to change it. So a lot of people have talked about overturning, like in particular, the two biggest issues potentially for overturning previous decisions would be, in fact, Roe v. Wade and then the ACA. But I want to remind us that the part of the reason that we have the case law that we do is precisely because of RBG, not only as a litigator, an early litigator, prior to that as a university professor, but as a Court of Appeals judge, as well as the Supreme Court justice. And what she contributed to was the development of laws about equality, interpretations of the Equal Protection Clause of both the 14th and the Fifth Amendment, as well as consider the implications of the recent 6-3 decision that was authored by none other than Neil Gorsuch, right? Bostock versus Clayton County, which set out protections for LGBTQ people under the context of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I think that it will be much harder to alter the precedents that were set for how we understand equality under the law in the United States, under constitutional amendment and congressional statute as well, precisely because the court is a conservative institution by definition. I don't mean conservative liberal, I mean conservative in that not changing. It's going to be very difficult to overturn many of these precedents. People might be focused on abortion, they might be focused on ACA, but the longer term strategy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg legacy lives not only in the decisions that went to her. These go from Reed versus Reed in 1971, Frontiero versus Richardson, 74, Weinberger versus Wiesenfeld, 75, all the way up. Bush v. Gore, Shelby County versus Holder, a long legacy of justification, judicial jurisprudence about equality, interpretation of constitutional law that will be very difficult to change. So people are concerned, if you're on the left, that you might see now a more conservative composition of the Supreme Court. But part of what RBG's story is not the breadcrumbs that she laid. It's a brick path that she laid. Very hard to break that up.
Okay. I had one other question. It was about politics and the political implications of this. And then I think we should open it up to Q&A, and you can ask about anything. You can ask about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what she did, or you can ask about what we've been talking about. If she's confirmed and the court strikes down protections for people with pre-existing conditions and then strikes down Roe v. Wade, what are the political consequences? Contrary to Jane's prediction, if that happens, what are the political consequences in 2022 and 2024? Jeff, you want to take a crack at that?
I can take a crack at that. I don't think those two things will happen. But let's imagine that they do, right? I think the Republicans are in trouble, frankly. I think one of the things the Republican Party can look forward to in 2022 is a bit of a comeback, right? They might get really hammered in this election. But then Biden and the Democratic coalition have to govern or try to govern for 2 years, right? And they can look for a bit of a comeback. They can start to plan who they're going to be in the post-Trump world, right? But if the court is striking down protections for Obamacare and eliminating Roe versus Wade, that's going to take a lot of wind out of their sails, right? They're going to have to essentially fight, rear guard action by the court in some ways, right? Some of their key issues will be taken out of the choice set at that point. So, I'm with Jane. One thing the court can do is it can narrow the scope of the decisions, right? Decisions from the past, right? And possibly that's something that can be done in some of these cases. But Justice Roberts is a pretty savvy character, and he cares about the legitimacy of the court. And he thinks about things like precedent. And I don't think that he wants to be in a position where the court is an actor that is going to be is going to be seen as being outside the bounds of what the median of the public wants at any point in time.
Mike?
I agree almost about 100% with Jeff on that, about 95%. One, generically, the off year is often good for the opposing party, though the Senate headwinds are tricky when you look state to state. But 2022 could be good if the Republicans can get their act together, which is, of course, a massive question mark these days. I think it is unlikely those things are overturned. I mean, the whole history of Roe v. Wade is the court kind of thinking a bit politically. And Roberts in particular totally understands, and the rupture that would cause, it would send it back to the states probably. And now it's not the 70s. So there would be fewer states that would want to start to, but some would. And it would be a big national divisive thing. It wouldn't be good for the court. The court didn't want to get into that meat grinder, 50 years ago. And I don't think it's excited about it now, even with more Republicans. So, but if it happened, it would rattle domestic politics in a way and in a way that would not be good for the Republicans, who are crawling out from wreckage if Trump loses anyway. So they may be a little more pragmatically minded, at least the leadership may, depending on who that is. Now, the other question is the ACA. I think short term it'll be a problem, but then we're just reclock the endless healthcare fight. The Democrats will have a new policy. The Republicans will oppose it. They will say, we will bring back your pre-existing conditions. The whole thing is about the mandate, and we could get all tangled up in that. But the Dems will take the issue, and they will go now to owning the problem, which you never want in healthcare, because voters like to punish anybody who's changing it. But there will be a big flag to wave, which is a healthcare system where you get some sort of coverage on pre-existing conditions. So I think that'll reclock and just become the same old debate yet again, while maybe some grown-ups deal with the fact that entitlement and healthcare costs keep rising. And so the public policy problem's getting worse, not better. Well, the political stagmire will continue.
So I want to thank all the folks from Trojan Family Weekend who've tuned into this, and I want to turn it over to them so they can ask questions of people who I think have provided us with a very interesting and at times provocative discussion. So let's turn this over to questions.
Thank you, Bob. I'll go ahead and start with our first question that is bringing the topic back to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. One of our attendees asks, in your opinion, which justice is most likely to retire next if Biden wins the election? How about if Trump wins the election? And part two is, in your opinion, who on the court is closest to RBG's views?
I have not looked at kind of the actuarial tables on the court, so to speak. So I haven't even tried to think about that, because generally it's health that kind of drives it. There was an attempt, it's been reported in the paper, by President Biden to kind of nudge RBG to maybe think about
President Biden?
And I'm sorry, see, Freudian slip, Bob. That ought to please you. I'm renting, not buying Democrats this year. It's painful. President Obama kind of hinted, why don't we clear the seat and let me appoint it? And she shut that down. So I really don't know, but I'm sure halfway through the Biden term, depending on the midterm Senate races, which still could be bad for the Republicans, and depending if they win a majority on election day, which they have a good shot to do this year, there will probably be some calculus involved. Now, again, it's easy for the White House political office to say, hey, we think you ought to let us change the seat, as Obama tried with RBG, and no guarantee it worked. Didn't work with her.
Steve Breyer, go ahead.
I'll say that, there's always been speculation that Clarence Thomas would retire if there's a Republican in office. So in the increasingly unlikely scenario where Trump gets a second term, possibly Clarence might decide that he's had enough and move on.
Steve Breyer is a very healthy 82-year-old. I think has no intention of retiring at all. But of course, this is unpredictable. You can never tell at what moment it's going to happen. By the way, who's closest to RBG on the court? Probably, I would think Sonia Sotomayor in terms of views.
I'm going to say it's Elena Kagan. I think we haven't seen enough of Kagan yet, but I'm going to say temperament-wise and style-wise, I think she's closer. I think Kagan is closer.
On style, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Kagan is a law professor, former law professor, solicitor general. She has a different different perspective, I think, which isn't to say that they're far apart from Sotomayor, but I just think in terms of like a shadow to RBG, it's going to be Kagan.
Okay, let's move on to our next question.
Do you think the United States Supreme Court should have term limits on the justices?
Who wants to start with that? Jeff?
It's not an unreasonable position to take. It shouldn't be lifetime terms, but maybe 15 years, something like that. It would create it might alleviate some of these particular issues, right? Where a justice is deciding whether to retire or not based upon who's in the White House or who might be in the White House after the next election. That when your time is up, your time is up, irregardless of the other political dynamics going on. I think it's reasonable, and I think I don't know to what extent that you'll have people on both sides agreeing to that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's an attractive idea, but I would artificially have it extend a little to give years of think about room, rather than say at 70 you're done. I'd extend it a little so they had a runway to time their departure a bit. But I think conceptually it's not a bad idea.
Next question.
We hear a lot about liberal justices and conservative justices. Has this always been the case? President Trump seems to treat his judicial appointments as belonging to him and guaranteeing that they will vote his way. Is SCOTUS becoming more political and counter-majoritarian, or has it always been that way?
That's such a good question.
No, go ahead.
That is such
Jane.
a good question. And, we don't have a Supreme Court scholar on this panel, and I think they would tell you that's a little bit of both, that it's always been political. It hasn't been divided in the same way. But I think it's important to consider, even in the past, some of the justices that were appointed by Republicans have turned out to be much more liberal. I mean, I give you David Souter as an example, a more recent example. And then there are also cases where justices who were thought to be more liberal have not been as liberal as we thought. It's usually the other way around, though, so that Republicans have appointed just judges and chief justices they expected to be much more conservative than they were. I think Kennedy became a surprise for many people with respect to LGBTQ rights. And I got to tell you, I was very surprised about Gorsuch in the Summers decision as well. So I do think it's a great question. I do think it's changed over time, as everything has. And that we are in a heavily polarized moment that we're in. Shouldn't be surprised to see that that the ownership of Supreme Court cases or justices is, a mode of behavior for this president in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree completely with Jane. I thought that was a great example, and I think a great answer. And I think one thing that's happened in recent decades is the rise of the Federalist Society, for example. A group that has had tremendous influence in courting justices, creating justices, courting them, and getting political figures like presidents, right, to essentially create a short list of people that they would approve of. That sort of thing has not happened in the past, but it's very much in keeping with, as Jane said, right, the very polarized world that we live in today.
Okay, let's move on to the next question.
Given that there is no longer a filibuster for Supreme Court justice confirmations, what are your thoughts on introducing a supermajority on the actual confirmation vote itself? Would this result in more moderate justices?
Yes, and I'm for it.
And it won't happen because the party in control doesn't want to give away that power. I mean, I think it would be very difficult to confirm Kavanaugh or Gorsuch or Amy Coney Barrett if there were a filibuster on Supreme Court nominations, which is precisely the reason Mitch McConnell swept it away.
Yeah, that's pretty self-evident, I think.
So it's a good idea, but like a lot of good ideas, like reforming the Electoral College, is not going to happen. Next
I'm going to say
question.
never say never on that. Never say never. Who would have thought we'd be in a pandemic? Who would have thought that we would have two outcomes, Electoral College outcomes inconsistent with the popular vote in a matter of 16 years? So never say never, Bob.
Who would have thought that? Who would have thought that maybe Texas might be blue, right, in the near future?
Where do we get a Kardashian president? Believe me, anything can happen now.
Well,
I
you
wish
know-
we were back to 60 votes for all judges in the Senate before Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell got into this dance of destruction.
See, American politics is all about dynamism. So some things are more stable than others. That's why I say never. I mean, there are a bunch of important rules that it's hard to change. Among them, the lifetime appointment of federal judges, whether SCOTUS or otherwise, that's going to be hard to change, but never say never. Remember, folks, California used to be reliably red, and it's not until Clinton comes into office that we become a blue state. So for those of you in California who've been living here for some time, and this doesn't look like the place where you were born, I'll bet you the same thing's going to be true for Texas and maybe other states as well. The story of American politics is a story of change. Some continuity, but mostly change. So never say never.
I will say, though, that a constitutional amendment, if we still live in a polarized world, right, a constitutional amendment where you need 2/3 in each chamber and 3/4 of the states to push something forward, that is still hard to imagine.
All right. Do we have another question?
We have a couple more I think we can get to. First being, what do you see as the issue with extending the court? We have over 300 million people in this country and not enough representation and nor diversity on the court.
Well, as I'll quickly say, I don't believe the equation that the population of the U.S. divided by numbers, if the average justice only represents 20 million people under that math rather than 30 is some big step forward. What it will become is a political auction. Whoever takes control will try to pack a few more judges in there, and we'll eventually wind up with a second Senate.
It is true that, it's not clear what the stopping point would be at that stage, right? We've been at 9 for 150-ish years. If we go up to 11 or 12, then we'll probably go up to 15 or 17, and then suddenly you would have a very large body. You could argue that large body would better reflect the diversity in the country. And I think if you wanted to go down that road, I think the term court packing has to leave the lexicon, right? That is
Right.
a pejorative term, and the Democrats would have to come up with a better term, court diversity or something like that, right? In order to push this forward in a positive way.
Well, people like to think that 435 is it, and 100's it, 9 is it. I mean, in the same way that, like, what was the old rule, you guys, about what proportion of your income you should spend on rent every month? Used to be something like 20%, and now for some people in certain areas, it's like 40%. These things are changing. So remember that as the nation changes, so as the United States actually grows in number of states, so too does the House of Representatives, and so too does the Senate. So we only restrict these sizes just as a matter of cultural practice, not necessarily as a matter of constitutional definition. So let's say we were to add Puerto Rico, a place that might very well deserve statehood, and that would change a bunch of things. So I don't think that it's impossible. I think that one is only lacking imagination if you think so.
I'll just, one last point on this. What worries me as a practical politician is right now the court is unique in that the justices kind of know and interact a little bit. Of course, there's the famous friendship between Tony Scalia and RBG, which is a good example for all of us. Once you start getting bigger numbers, you start getting into factionalism and process fights. And the governance of it, much like we now have so much of in the Senate, that will enter the court in a way we haven't had so far. Maybe that's good. It's more small d democracy. But I like the fact that judiciary has been immune, or at least partially immune from that compared to the other two branches.
Okay.
That's true. In terms of coordination, I think that's very true. I would say the political scientists have for many decades considered the Supreme Court justices to be politicians, right? Just like any other politician.
Let's take one more question, and then I want to sign off.
Wonderful. So we've been getting a few different questions in about the future of our democracy. So I'll do my best here to summarize them. United States prides itself in a fair trial, starting with the lower courts. Even with the selection of a panel of jurors aims to provide a fair trial. How can the highest court in our country be fair and promote intellectual and productive discussions if it is so partisan? What are the implications for our future generations? What will happen if the legitimacy of the Supreme Court decreases? So really the questions we're getting in are, what are the implications for our democracy?
Jane, you want to take a crack at that?
We're in a time of great change. And I do think that most of the time you hear people thinking about all the terrible stuff that can happen and all the terrible stuff that's happening from the pandemic as an example of chaos, as an example of a lot of things changing, many unexpected things. But I have a lot of faith in us that we should be able to change and learn and grow. This is what universities are for. We're here to learn about the past to better see the future. Do I think this is going to be a bumpy road? Yeah. But I also think that it is the very people that we're educating here and the alumni who continue to come back and learn and grow that will allow us to adapt and change despite the circumstances. I still believe in democracy, and I think we've got a good path forward.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I agree.
I would agree as well. And, I think if nothing else comes from this discussion of court packing, I think the public's perception that there are actually 9 justices on the Supreme Court probably has gone up over time. So that's good.
I just, I think there are 9 members on is it a baseball team? Is that how many people are out on the field at once?
That is true, yes.
Why don't we just go European and go soccer? There are 11 women on the field at a time. We can go with 11,
Or we go with American football and there'll be 11 as well. We don't even have to leave the American sports.
Baseball's the American game, 9.
So I want to thank Jeff. I want to thank my friend Jane Junn. I want to thank my co-director, Mike Murphy. And most of all, I want to thank all of you who are participating in Trojan Family Weekend. Extraordinary university, extraordinary students, and extraordinary parents. Thanks a lot.